Hello, welcome to Style Techniques in CSS3. My name is Paul Sheriff. I'm a business solutions architect with Fairway Technologies Incorporated. Fairway Technologies specializes in custom software development and developer mentoring. Check us out at fairwaytech.com. For this course, I'm going to assume that you already know how to use cascading style sheets, but you want to see some of the new CSS3 styles that you can apply to your HTML. The agenda for this course are to look at media queries, pseudo classes, text effects, filters, rounded corners, drop shadows, and gradients. Let's get started. Most everybody should be familiar with media queries these days. It's what allows us to do responsive design. And CSS frameworks such as Bootstrap, Foundation, and Materialize all use media queries to give us that responsive design. What this means is that we can change styles based on some sort of criteria like the width and the height of the viewport, the width and the height of the device, the orientation, landscape or portrait, screen resolution, print, or maybe even speech readers. All of these things can be controlled with media queries. Let's take a look at a few media queries. This example here shows some text to just show what effect we can use for different margins based on the screen size. So you can see as I shrink and I grow the browser, you can see the left margin gets larger and smaller based on the size. Let's take a look at this particular one here. What I've done is I've created a container with a margin left of 10 ems. Down here we've got a div with a class of container that says this is some text to show the effect of different screen sizes on margin. Very simple. So obviously when we're at the full screen here, this container style is applied. But when the max width is 970 pixels, the container is going to drop that container to a margin left of 5 ems. And when the max width of the browser reaches 750 pixels or less, the container will change the margin left to 1 ems. So the media rule here simply decides based on whatever expression you passed it, it'll decide which of these particular styles to now apply to your HTML. Let's take a look at the next one, which is our print. We'll run this. And you can see that this p tag here has no margin, but this one has a pretty good indentation here. But let's go ahead and say print. And then look at here, look at this. See, let's increase the size here. Now you can see that this text now is lined up with the one that has no margin. So how did we do that? In this case, what we did is we set the media rule to print, and the container now changes its margin left to 0. When you use the print, you need to wrap all your other styles now into a media screen. This means that we're going to change everything based on whether we're in screen mode or print mode. So again, what the media rule is doing is determining based on the web page what mode it's in, and then it can change the styles as appropriate. There were a number of new pseudo classes that were added to CSS3 as well. We're not going to go through all of them, but we'll go through a few. There's one for not, so this allows you to specify some sort of selector within the not expression there, and then all elements that are not matched by that are then, the style is then applied to those. We have first child, so the first child in a container, regardless of the type of item, could be selected. We have first of type, so the first type specified within a parent. So again, the rule would be applied to that particular item. Empty, so all elements that do not have any text or children. So things like a p tag or a div tag that just open and close with no text and no children, then the style could be applied to those. We also have nth child, so it uses a numeric value within n to target child elements with respect to their position in the parent. And we'll take a look at this. It allows us to maybe add alternating background colors to table rows or any repeating items. We have only child, so any element that has no siblings, we could apply a selector to that. So let's take a look at some of these pseudo classes. As our first example, let's take a look at the nth child. So we see this a lot on repeating backgrounds where you might want to make every alternating one a different color. So as you can see, this one has a light gray background and a blue color text. This one has a dark blue background with white text. Let's take a look at this. So I've got a div class container, and then I have a bunch of divs, item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Here is our CSS. So I've got container div. On this one we have background color is blue, color is white. And then I have another container div which has a background color light gray and a color of blue. But I've applied the pseudo class nth child and I specified odd. By doing odd, it says starting with the first one, so 1 is odd. Then let's make the first one here light gray, and then the second one would be considered even, so then the normal background color is applied. So that's how it works. Now, there's a couple of things that's kind of interesting here. I mean, obviously I can change this to even. I could change it to 4n plus 1, for instance, and if I save that and I refresh this, see, now we're getting every fourth one is now that light gray background. But there's something else here that I want you to be aware of. Let's go ahead and type in odd here. And let's see what happens if we just stick something else here, some other text in a p tag. And then let's go ahead and rerun this. So now look what happened. Item 1 is now the reverse of what we had. The reason why is because this is considered item 1. This is now item 2, which makes it even, so it doesn't match that criteria. So now it's kind of flipped. So just be aware that if you have other items in here, it can change the meaning of even and odd. Let's take a look at another pseudo class, which is nth last child. Now this one you use a -n plus some value. So in this case, if we do the +1, and let's run this one, so let's stop this and run this page. Now it's just going to give us the last one is applied. So it says start from the back, and then add 1. If you add 2, save that, refresh, now we get the last 2. So nth last child is another option that we have here. And let's take a look at our last pseudo class. There are others, but we're only going to cover these. I think you're getting the idea that these are just some new pseudo classes that can be applied. In this case, I'm saying the nth last child of -n plus 2, so the last 2 children, but apply the not pseudo class to that whole expression. So same exact HTML we've been working with, but now let's run this. And now, as you can see, what are we getting? The last 2 are applied the background color, right? Because everything else, -n plus 2, but knotted, means everything but the last 2 get the background color of light gray and a color of blue. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at some of the text effects that we can now do in CSS3. We can apply a text shadow to some text. We can do word wrapping and word breaking, so it allows the browser to break long words. We can do resizing of a particular div. And we can also now do custom fonts, and this allows us to display a font exactly the same on each browser or machine. This was something that was hard to do, very hard to do, if not impossible to do, just several years ago. Well, let's take a look at some text effects. Our first example just simply shows some text that has a shadow on it. Let's go take a look at this. So I've got an H2 here that says this text should have a shadow on it. And here it is right here. We've applied to this H2 text-shadow with a 0.1 em. That's the horizontal shadowing. The vertical is also 0.1. The blur distance. And then, of course, what color you would like that shadow. Pretty simple. Let's open up Text Effects 2 here. Now what I have here is I have a p tag, that has quite a few words in it, but I have one really big long word, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. What I've done for this p tag is I've applied these different properties here, and one of them is word wrap, and I've applied break-word. Now, to make this really stand out, what I've done is I've set a hard-coded width here for the p tag. Let's run this, and we'll see that now it has actually broken that word somewhere, wherever it became, it was going to extend over that 8 M's. Let's comment this out so we can take a look at what happens if I don't have that option set. Now it's actually exceeding the width that we'd specified for the p tag. So having this nice little word wrap break word option is very handy. Let's now take a look at resizing a div. Now this one is only going to work in Chrome, Opera, or Firefox, and you might try it on IE Edge, but it's not going to work on any of the older browsers. But what this does, it puts a little handle right here that we can now grab with our mouse, and we can actually resize the div here. Okay, not something widely supported, so you probably want to use this with, a little bit sparingly because it may not work on all browsers. And of course, on a mobile browser, it might be hard to kind of grab that, so probably not very good for a mobile application. And let's go take a look at doing custom fonts. So on this one, I'm actually getting this family Satisfy from the fonts.googleapis.com. And now I can set the font family to Satisfy and cursive. And I can now apply that to this H2. So again, this is something that did not really work several years ago because every font had to be then, downloaded to the machine. And so you had to have your users had to install stuff, and that just wasn't a good experience. But now we have these nice custom web fonts that are consistent across browsers. CSS3 added some filter functions that allow us to apply a graphical effect to elements. We could blur an element, we can set the contrast on an element, and we can set the grayscale. Let's take a look at some of these filter functions. Our first example, we'll take a look at the blur effect. So here's our original image, and here's the blurred effect. Let's take a look at this. What I did is I created an image blur class, filter, blur, and then how many pixels you wish to offset the image, and that's what gives it that blurring effect. And I just applied that here to the image class, image blur, to the same source as the original. Now let's take a look at applying contrast. Let's run this one. So again, we see the original photo, and now we see a very high contrast applied to that. So again, a filter, contrast, and I set the contrast to 200%. And then I applied that class down here on an image that has the same source as the original. And our last example is grayscale. Let's take a look at this one. So now we first again have the original image, and then we applied a grayscale to all of it. So all color has been removed. Everything's now in just a nice black and white. And again, I created a class here, image gray, and I applied the filter grayscale, and I set it to be 100%. And then I apply that to the image that has the same source as the original. One of the most requested features for CSS3 was the ability to do rounded corners. So it just helps round out some element corners. We typically apply these to things like buttons or maybe input fields. And all it does is kind of softens the edges of the elements to make it just a little bit easier on your user's eyes. So let's take a look at some rounded corners. Here's an example of applying rounded corners on buttons. So you can see that these buttons now have just very nice rounded corners. And if we come back here and we take a look at these, I've got two inputs, type of submit, and I applied a class called BTN. So here's the BTN here, and what's important here is the border dash radius. This is what gives us that rounded border. If we were to take this off, save that, and run it, you can see how these buttons just look a little harsher. They're just, a little bit more so square. Whereas when you just add this simple little border radius, this really kind of just helps soften it up a little bit so it doesn't look as harsh. Now let's take a look at another example here. For this one, we don't have to put it around everywhere. We can actually just specify which area we would like to round the corner on. So in this case, I can do a border-bottom-right- radius of 4 ems. So I'm just applying it now to the bottom right. So we have just a couple of different options here, right? If you do border radius, it's all the way around. And then we have all these different examples here of bottom right, top left, things like that that we can then apply. Let's take a look at another example. This is one where we just apply to the bottom, both the bottoms now. Kind of looks like a little smile. So on this one, all we've done is applied bottom right and bottom left. Now there's one more example that we're going to take a look at here. And this is where we're going to use border radius, and instead of just specifying a single value, we're actually going to specify what we want for each corner. Now this is the same as doing all the individual top right, top left, bottom right, bottom left. Let's go ahead and run this and take a look at what this does, and it just makes it a very kind of curvy corners. Now I'm not going to say you're going to do all of this all the time, but I wanted to show you the different options and what you can accomplish with rounded corners. Another style that used to be kind of popular, maybe isn't so much right now, and that's drop shadows, where this just helps make elements stand out a little bit more. You can add a shadow on any side. You can add some blurring to it so it may not be as pronounced, and you can spread out the shadow from the element. Let's take a look at applying drop shadows. Here's an example of a drop shadow added to our buttons. And one thing I want you to notice is that the shadow is also rounded, and that's because we had the border radius applied to these as well. So let's take a look. All we do is add box dash shadow, and it's an X and a Y coordinate, and then black or whatever color you want. And again, if you specify the border radius, the shadow uses that border radius as well. Let's now look at another example where we're shifting the shadow now to the left and the top. So now it's like the light source is coming from a different angle. How do we do that? Let's take a look here. All we do is we specify a negative value for both the X and the Y. If you modify one of these and make it a positive value, let's go ahead and save that and run. You can see what happens. It now makes it on the right and the top. So you can play with these and see what works for you. Our next example allows us to apply a blur radius here. So we'll add one more parameter here on the box shadow, and this one specifies a blur. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like. So now you see it's kind of a little bit more, just not as pronounced, right? The shadow's just a little bit blurred there. So the higher the number that you add here, the more the blur effect is going to be. So if we change this to 0.8 from a 0.5 and refresh, see how it just got a little bit lighter now. So we can do drop shadows with blurs. And the last thing we can add to the drop shadow is another parameter, which is our spread distance or the spread radius. Let's go ahead and run this. And now this shows how it just makes it even more offset. So again, the higher the number that we place here, let's put a 0.5, so we'll double that spread and see what happens, right? So now it's just larger pronounced shadow. So you can do whatever feels comfortable here, but it just does help us add a little bit more texture, a little bit more depth to that shadow. Another way to add visual interest to your web pages is to maybe apply a gradient. And a gradient is just a transition from one color or colors to another gradually over the space that you specify. We can do this transition linear, which means down, up, left, right, or diagonally, Or we can use a radial pattern for this transition, which means from the center outwards. Let's take a look at some gradients. Prior to CSS 3, you would use a background image and a background repeat, and this image had to have the gradient effect. So you can see the gradient effect here. So that would be how we used to have to do gradients. Let's take a look then. And there's a gradient applied over a height of 20 ems and a width of 20 ems. But there's new ways to do it now. So let's take a look at our gradient linear. So this will be our linear approach to this. Now in this one, we're going to do a background linear dash gradient to bottom from black to white. All right, let's take a look. And there you go. So we're going from black to white to the bottom. So you can just change any of these, right? You can say to top. And let's look at this now. So now it just turns it around, right? So now we're going to the top from black to white. Now, obviously, you'd want to change your color there if you did change this as I just did. Now, you can get some very interesting effects if we do a repeating linear gradient. So in this case, we're doing a repeating linear gradient. It's a minus 45 degree angle from gray to light gray. But now I'm specifying some additional things here, some sizes for these. Light gray is a 1M, a white then is 0.5 Ms, and a white is 1M. Let's take a look at this. This actually creates kind of an interesting pattern. Kind of funky looking, 45 degree angle. Okay, we've got the light gray, we've got the little bit of white in there. So just kind of an interesting looking background. Now I'm not saying you're going to use this again all the time, but again, it is something that we now can take advantage of. Let's take a look at a radial gradient now. So remember what I said, it's from the center outwards. So in this case, you can see it's white out to a black in a radial pattern. So you can see this from white to black. Okay, so again, you could switch those colors around and then it would go from black to white. And again, we can do some interesting patterns with this repeating radial gradient here. So again, just by specifying some different colors, the sizes of each of those colors. Let's go ahead and run this so you can take a look at what this looks like. And we can get something very psychedelic there. Kind of like the old Hitchcock films or something. And let's take a look at one more example here. And that might be where you change from a linear gradient to a radial gradient when we hover over a div. So let's take a look. So here's linear to radial, linear to radial. Maybe you do this on a button, right? Just to kind of allow the user to see that they've just hovered over a button and they're able to click on that. In this video course, we looked at how CSS3 has just so many different ways to style elements now. We can use media queries for responsive design. We have pseudo classes to help with repeating elements. We have rounded corners and drop shadows, which help soften edges. And gradients add some interesting background effects. Search for me, Paul Sheriff, on Pluralsight. I have 17 videos up there currently. With Pluralsight, I cover a lot of different things, a lot of Angular, some MVC, some Bootstrap, XML. So take a look. Just go up to pluralsight.com and search for Paul Sheriff. All of the sample code that you saw in this particular course is available at pdsa.com/downloads. Select Fairway Video Blog and then select Style Techniques in CSS3. Check out fairwaytech.com for all your custom software development and developer mentoring needs. We also offer virtual CIO and CTO services. Contact me, P. Sheriff, at fairwaytech.com. And also check for my Pluralsight videos on pluralsight.com. Just search for Paul Sheriff. I hope you enjoyed this course from Fairway Technologies.